Good evening and welcome to our Robertson School Speaker Series event with our distinguished guest, Dorothy Butler Gilliam, and our distinguished moderator, Diane Walker. We're very excited to welcome both of them to the virtual Robertson School today. Ms. Gilliam is joining us from Washington, D.C., and Ms. Walker from the NBC 12 station here in Richmond. My name is Marcus Messner, and I'm the director of the Robertson School of Media and Culture. I'm excited to welcome you to a conversation with a trailblazer who has paved the way for many female and minority journalists in newsrooms around the country. We're so excited to have Dorothy Butler Gilliam back at the Robertson School. She was actually previously a distinguished Dabney professor here. During our event today, our audience members can post questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar here. As a comment on our live stream on our Facebook page, or as a tweet on Twitter by using the hashtags VCU Robertson or SPJVA. I would like to thank our two co-sponsors of this event, Jeff South of the Virginia Pro chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and Bonnie Newman-Davis for the BND Institute of Media and Culture, and she's joining us in the webinar here as well. Thanks for your partnership and your teamwork to make this event happen. It was great to work with both of you. Before Bonnie Newman-Davis introduces our speaker and our moderator, I would like to ask you to mark your calendars already for our next speaker series event on November 5th, 2 days after the election at 6 p.m. And we will have an alumni panel to discuss the outcome of the presidential election. We'll announce more details about that event in the coming days. And with that, I wish you a great evening at the Robertson School Speaker Series.
Thank you, Marcus, for that warm introduction. Good evening, everyone. We're so glad that you are here with us this evening for this exciting program. I am pleased that my BND Institute of Media and Culture is part of this presentation, hosted by VCU's Robertson School of Media and Culture and the Virginia Pro chapter of SPJ. I'm very appreciative of the Robertson School's faculty, staff, and students for all of their hard work in making this program happen. You've done an excellent job, and you can count on an A when final grades come out in the next few weeks. Also, I owe a special thank you to SPJ's president, Jeff South, and my fellow SPJ board members for giving this project a green light and thumbs up. Thank you again, team. Finally, I would be remiss if not mentioning Barbara Vance of Speakers Unlimited, Inc., who has been an invaluable resource in planning this evening's program. Barbara, if you are out there, please know that when you decide to retire, I want you to train me in every aspect of your business and then sell it to me. You are a true professional at the top of your game, and you have been a joy to work with. Watching you, I've learned a lot. I also called on my former VCU student, Fatima Blackwell, to assist us tonight in Washington, where Dorothy is located. Fatima, you rock. Thank you so, so much. You were a great student then and now. You're teaching me a lot of things. In introducing our speaker and moderator this evening, I have a quick story to share with you. Exactly 40 years ago, probably in October, I drove from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was in graduate school, to Washington, D.C. to attend the National Association of Black Journalists convention. Then as now, the convention was stocked with recruiters who were seeking talented students to place in newsrooms throughout the country. I was directed to an attractive, kind, and serene woman who reviewed the articles that I'd written during my various summer internships. I think that she most enjoyed my review of a James Brown concert that had stretched into the wee hours of the next morning at an Ann Arbor nightclub. She smiled and voiced approval of my work and gave me some much needed advice and encouragement. That woman was Dorothy Butler Gilliam, someone whom I continue to credit for helping me land my first full-time job with the Richmond News Leaders. And that was just 3 3 months after I left graduate school, finished graduate school. As special as that story is for me, my experience isn't that unusual because Dorothy Gilliam has assisted, inspired, and motivated countless journalists, young and not so young, during her lengthy career at the Washington Post and beyond. Although I knew then that Mrs. Gilliam was employed at the Washington Post, I did not know that she was the newspaper's first Black woman reporter. From meeting Mrs. Gilliam 40 years ago to reading her wonderful 2019 memoir, Trailblazer, a pioneering journalist's fight to make the media look more like America, I have learned so much about her life as a journalist, daughter, wife, parent, and leader. In doing so, I've learned so much about myself. Is it any coincidence that my own mother's name is Dorothy? Here's a snapshot of Dorothy Butler Gilliam's journey thus far. Gilliam was 23 and working in a segregated Washington, D.C. in 1961. There was no civil rights bill, and when cab drivers saw her dark brown skin, they pressed down on their accelerators, refusing to give her a ride. People were so unaccustomed to seeing Black reporters that they wouldn't believe she was a journalist. An example, Gilliam was once assigned a story about a white woman who was turning 100 years old. Upon entering the woman's apartment building, the Black doorman told her, "The maid's entrance is in the back." When covering the integration of Ole Miss University in the Deep South, Gilliam had to think practically and be courageous. In need of accommodations, she spent the night in a Black funeral home because it was too risky to try to stay in a white hotel in Oxford, Mississippi. Now remember, this was in the early 1960s, 1961, and we're talking about a woman. So can you imagine having to be up against those odds? Besides having worked at the Washington Post as a reporter, editor, and columnist, Gilliam was director of the newspaper's Young Journalist Development Program. She also has been a television reporter in Washington, D.C., and a senior research scientist at George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, where she founded a program encouraging young people to pursue careers in journalism. Gilliam is a former president of the National Association of Black Journalists and has a close relationship with Virginia Commonwealth University. In 2000, she was a Dabney visiting professor and a commencement speaker for the Robertson School when it was then known as the School of Mass Communications. Gilliam has received numerous awards in recognition for her work, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Washington Press Club and the Four Mothers Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Center for Research. Shortly, we'll hear more from Dorothy Gilliam as she discusses her excellent book, Trailblazer. After Dorothy speaks, our moderator, Diane Walker, will pose questions to her and get questions from the audience. If any of you are from the Richmond, Virginia area, Diane Walker is a familiar and beloved broadcast journalist, someone who I also consider a good friend. As an anchor for NBC 12 and Fox News at 10, Diane is the face of NBC 12's flagship franchise, 12 on Your Side, where she investigates consumer complaints and gives voice to the voiceless. Diane, who grew up in Richmond, graduated from the University of Virginia, has built a reputation over 3 decades of fighting for the little guy. She is a friend to public schools and gives her time when called on to let students know that they matter. Diane personally mentors high school and college students aspiring to be journalists. That's amazing. Diane lives life to the affirmation, you shouldn't go through life with a catcher's mitt on both hands. You need to be able to throw something back. Her numerous awards and recognitions include the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame, outstanding effort by an individual reporter from the Associated Press, and the Distinguished Consumer Service Award from the Virginia Citizens Consumer Council. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We'll now hear from Dorothy Butler Gilliam.
Good evening, and thank you very, very much for that very generous introduction. I am so happy to be here and to be a part of this event tonight. It's always a special joy when I am asked to talk about my memoir, Trailblazer. I was a journalistic witness to two of the most important pieces of legislation of the 20th century. That was the Public Accommodations Act, and the other, of course, was the Voting Rights Act. When I started journalism, I began in the Black press. I worked, but at the age of 17, I was working as a secretary after my college classes at the Louisville Defender, which is a Black weekly newspaper. But one day the editor came to me and he said, the society editor is ill, so we're going to send you out to cover some stories. And I was surprised and didn't think I could do it, but I did. I went out, and Louisville, Kentucky is a very deeply segregated city, and it was certainly then when I was growing up. But it was a surprise to me that journalism opened the doors to just so many new experiences, because I found that there was a small Black middle class in Louisville that I didn't know about. These were, you know, the doctors, the lawyers, actually the editor of the newspaper, and they lived in a certain section of town. My dad was a minister, and we lived in a working class section of town, although by the time I actually worked at the Louisville Defender, my dad had passed. But one of the great things about journalism, and one of the reasons I've been so happy as a journalist, is that it does open the door to new worlds, and it gives you experiences that you wouldn't expect to have. It's a front row seat of history, and that has been just a tremendous motivating factor in my life. But the Black press was very important and gave me much of what I needed. For example, after working at the Louisville Defender, I knew that I wanted to go somewhere and really study to become a journalist. And I went to Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, and got a degree there. But when I started my career, my first thought was, well, I'll ask to see if I can get a job with my hometown daily newspaper, which was the Courier Journal and Louisville Times. And when I sent them a letter and told them about my credentials, they summarily pushed me aside. They said, oh, you know, we only have a few slots, and they are for the University of Indiana has already claimed those, so we don't have any intern slots or anything. So I was really quite happy to get a job at the Tri-State Defender in Memphis, Tennessee. And from there, I had the opportunity to see and to help cover the integration of the Central High School, which was really very violent. It was the worst integration, I guess, that anybody could have considered, because my boss, who was, his name was Alex Wilson, he was beaten by a mob. And I was back in the office where he left me covering what was going on in Memphis. And I looked up on our television screen and television set a little black and white television set in the office. And I saw the news that my boss was beaten by this mob. So I knew I had to get to Little Rock. So I ended up going to Little Rock, Arkansas, with a photographer and really having the opportunity to cover this violent integration of Little Rock. But one of the things that happened was that I also met a lot of the Black reporters who had been covering the South for years. They are the ones who used to go behind the cotton curtain and write about these stories that nobody else cared about. They would write stories, but they knew that if the white sheriffs knew they were writing about what they were seeing, the lynchings, the murders, that they would be killed. So they went, at night into these places behind what we call behind the cotton curtain. But what they taught me was how much courage it really took to be a journalist. And so when I decided I really wanted to be a daily newspaper reporter, and I was able to get into Columbia University, and there's a long story in the book about that. Just remember what life was like for Black people in 1960 and 61. First of all, of course, the great Dr. Martin Luther King had led the bus boycott. And of course, we had the beginning of change. And that affected me so deeply because I saw that, here were people who worked as maids and worked in homes of these white people in Montgomery. But because they refused to ride on these segregated buses anymore, of course, led by Rosa Parks, they decided they were going to walk. And for a year, they walked to work, worked as a maid and then walked home. And you can imagine how exhausted they were. And so I knew about that because my own mother, who had been trained as a teacher, she was trained in a community college so she could teach in the South, in the suburbs or in the country, but she couldn't teach in the city. So she ended up having to be a maid as well. So I knew that the kind of sacrifice that Black people were making in order to make a change in this country. So I was deeply affected by that bus boycott. So after I graduated and I worked for the Tri-State Defender, and then I was actually hired by Jet Magazine shortly after that. So I was able to go back to Chicago and work there for 2 years. But I always had this dream of being a daily newspaper reporter. And I decided to enroll at Columbia. It took me a while to get there because their first idea was, well, your credentials aren't good enough. You have a bachelor's degree from a Black university, but we need more liberal arts hours. So I went back to school. I went back to, I got a job in Tuskegee, and then I was enrolled at Columbia. And one of the things that I learned at Columbia was, how to be a daily newspaper reporter. But it was very different from being a weekly reporter. But I still had no idea that my first job was going to be at the Washington Post. What happened was at the end of the school year, the city editor of the Washington Post routinely came to the Columbia campus in New York City, and he would interview all the graduates. And he told me, he said, we're kind of interested in you, but you just don't have any daily newspaper experience. So I suggest that you go to a small newspaper and get some experience and then come back and talk to us. And, but something different was about to happen with me because I was going to Africa for the summer. And I was going as part of a program called Operation Crossroads Africa. And the whole idea was to have African American and white students interact with African students and to do some kind of manual labor that made a difference in that country. So when I was in DC, I went to the Post to visit, as Mr. Gilbert had invited me to. And when I got there, when I told them I was going to Africa, that just seemed to interest them. And they said, well, would you send us something you've written? And I did. And when I came back, I was hired as the first African-American woman reporter. Now, again, remember, this was before the Civil Rights Act, the Public Accommodations Act. It was before the Voting Rights Act. All of these things Martin Luther King was working toward. And, but he also said, you know, it's really important for, as we get this civil rights movement going, it's important for you and people like you. He wasn't talking to me personally, even though I went to his church to hear him preach when I was working in Alabama. But he said, you know, go in and make a difference. So that really stirred me to go ahead and start at the Washington Post when I was invited by the Post to become their first African-American reporter. Now, I have to say that it was very hard. It was very hard. It was, as Bonnie mentioned, you know, taxi cabs wouldn't pick me up when I'm trying to get a cab so I can write my story and get it back and make my deadline. It was very frustrating, but I had to do it, and I had to make it work. And there were times, and again, Bonnie, you told it so well, that sometimes it felt like when I went into white neighborhoods, it was an invitation to be abused. And one time, as you recall, the doorman, when he saw me, he said, you can't come in the front door. The maid's entrance is around the back. And, you know, I was dressed nicely. I looked very professional. And, but he just couldn't believe that I was a reporter for the Washington Post. So I gave him my identification card and all of that, and he took it inside, and they finally said, okay, and they sent me upstairs, and I wrote the story. And the next day, the woman called me and said, you know, it was such a lovely story, and thanked me for it. But I think one of the things that helped me was that I felt I was, you know, really showing people a different image of African Americans, and that was another, you know, job that I had. In addition to being a reporter and writing the story, it was also a time to help show the larger public, very often the larger, very prejudiced, you know, very prejudiced public, that we African Americans were able and willing to do what it takes, you know, to really be a part of this nation. And so one of the things that I recall also was, you know, just the small slights on a regular basis that were so difficult to deal with. For example, some of my colleagues would be, you know, reasonably civil inside, but when they saw me outside, they would pretend they didn't know me. They would turn their heads the other way. And, you know, I thought, what is the matter with these people? But, you know, once again, I knew that if I failed, if I said, this is crazy, I'm quitting, then it would have been much more difficult for the next Black woman. And I remember that the first Black man who was hired only worked for about a year and a half. His name was Simeon Booker. And he said, you know, he said, I was getting neurotic. People thought I was sick because he said, trying to cover stories in a city where even the dog cemeteries are segregated. You know, he said it was just too much. So I didn't want to fail, and so I persevered. And I think that you know, that is not easy, but it's something I think that we as African Americans really have to do. But one of the things that I think when I look back at those early years, one of the assignments that I think had the most impact on me was being one of the reporters from the Post who was sent to the university, to cover the integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962. Now, you have to remember, and I'm sure many people in your audience will remember, that Mississippi was like a place apart. It was a lynching state. It was a state where Black life was cheap. It was a place where the university was like this bastion of white supremacy. And it was very, very difficult for, to see how a lone man, one person, had the courage to integrate the University of Mississippi. His name was James Meredith, and he was he had been in the Army, and he said that he really came back to fight white supremacy. And just thinking about the people who have made a way for us as African Americans. He is one of those people, and recently there was a film made about him that was shown on the Smithsonian Channel, and I was very, very pleased to see that. But back then, it took him 5 different times before he was slipped onto the campus of the University of Mississippi, and it was being orchestrated in part by Robert Kennedy, the U.S. Attorney General. He was working with marshals. It was a huge accomplishment to get him in. But to give you an idea about the violence that accompanied his going in, 2 people were murdered on campus the same night that they actually slipped him in to one of the dormitories. And he lived in that dormitory by himself, that whole dormitory by himself, except for the police who were there the federal police who were there to protect him. But I think one of the reasons covering the University of Mississippi integration was just facing the reality of what I, as a reporter, would face. The white people who were part of the team, they could stay at the Sand and Sea Motel and, sit in the lobby and, have lunch or dinner and talk about the story and trade ideas as reporters do. But I knew that they would not rent me a room. And so the photographer with whom I was working, Ernest Withers, he said, okay, let's go to the Black Funeral Home. They'll know somebody who can, who probably has a bed that you can stay in. And when I got there, the funeral director said, well, we've got a spare room upstairs, and you're welcome to stay here. So I slept with the dead. I did what I had to do, and nobody bothered me. So that worked out. But it was, again, just really important, I think, for our audience to know, some of the kind of experiences that those of us who were, the first or the second, trying to integrate these these huge industries like the journalism industry, you know, that it was very, very challenging. And I certainly really, really, you know, just had so much respect for the other handful of Blacks who were doing the same thing I was doing. There were, you probably could have gotten all of us in the country, all of the Black journalists working for white newspapers at that time. You could have probably gotten all of us into, you know, a very small room. So that, but it was important, I think, to go in and to make a difference and to show that, yes, you could succeed and you know, we can do the job. And one of the challenges I found was when we would go to our white editors and say, you know, we need more diversity. We need to hire some Black people. And they would say, oh, but we just can't find any qualified, you know. And, you know, we knew, the few Black journalists who were there, we knew that was not true. But we had to just jump into action and start training programs. And one of the programs with which I was affiliated, and I was one of the co-founders of the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. At that point, it was just called the Institute for Journalism Education. But one of our real leaders, Robert Maynard, died prematurely, and the organization was renamed for him. So that was our response. You know, when we saw a problem that needed solving, we jumped into action. We said, we've got to make a difference. And so we were able to get the use of college classrooms. The first place was the University of California at Berkeley. In the summer, they didn't use their department of journalism. And so we were able to use that, and we started training. And it was a summer program for minority journalists. And so, you know, we were kind of beginning to make a difference by just training more people. And when I look back at those days when we were all struggling together to make a difference, I realized that, you know, we knew what we were doing. We knew that change had to come, and it wasn't going to come from our white bosses. It had to come from us. And so thank God we were able to have allies and those who could help us. But over the years, the Institute for Journalism Education has trained certainly more than 1,000 people. We started out just training people as journalists to go on small daily newspapers. But after a few years, we decided we needed to train other African Americans and other people of color as editors. So we started a program at the University of Arizona at Tucson. And then after a few years, we realized we have to start training more African American as managers. And we started a program at Northwestern University in New York, in Washington, in Chicago. So that is, you know, that was one of the ways that we just kept pushing to make a difference. When we saw a need that needed to be filled, we just kind of got busy and filled it. So when I look today and at the whole issue of diversity and inclusion in media, it's still a big problem. And of course, it is a time when this country is facing so many complex challenges that when you don't have that diversity and inclusion, it really, really makes a difference. For example, in the current coronavirus pandemic, there has not been really good, strong coverage of the disproportionate impact on African Americans. It's been noted, but you know, the kind of reporting where you dig deep and you look to see what can change and how can you change it and what are the factors that go into this. So the Institute for Journalism Education, now called the Maynard Institute, and I still sit on its board, they have been really working very, very hard to get the industry to understand the importance of diversity and inclusion, but also taking it a step further to say it's important that people of color begin to feel as if they belong to this in this nation, that they belong in these positions, they belong. It's a sense of really understanding that there is so much that needs to be done, but at the same time, there needs to be a response not only on the part of African Americans and other journalists of color, but also a response in the industry itself, because the industry is really beginning to see that its coverage is not keeping up with the change that's going on in the streets. So the problems that I faced many years ago are different, but there still are many, many issues that need to be resolved. And it's important that, you know, we keep the fight, keep up the fight, keep the struggle against those who don't want us to have inclusion, those who don't want us to be, you know, a part of the society. We must keep the struggle. We must continue the struggle. And just to conclude, I want to have time for your questions and your comments. I would like to spend just a moment in which I really want this nation to begin to change dramatically. It's been 400 years of Black people pushing and taking 2 steps forward and then being pushed 3 and 4 steps backward. We've given so much to this country. We've sacrificed so much. We've served in places where we weren't wanted but were needed. You know, it is time. It is time for a change. It's time for the media to dismantle its systemic racism. It's time. It's time for for young people to have a sense, just as the Black Lives Matter movement, but to have a sense that they can bring about change, they can make a difference. And I'm certain that everybody who is listening to this webinar is already making plans for how they're going to vote. Because for someone who came along even before there was a voting rights bill and who endured all the heartache and the hardship of not being able to vote, this is probably the most important election of our times. But I always, when I have a chance to talk to audiences of all races, I underscore how important it is not to be afraid of the African American voice, not to be afraid of the African American intellect, creativity, you know, courage, all those things that can add to the vibrancy of this nation, that can really be a part of what it really takes to make America great again. You know, to really make America great, it's going to have to take inclusion. It's going to have to take the idea that all human beings are made in the image of God and are deserving of the very best. That no group has any rights that another group should be denied.
Dorothy Butler Gilliam, you are one amazing woman. This is Diane with NBC 12, and I bring you greetings from NBC 12 and Fox Richmond. It is just awesome. I'm just so humbled to share you in this moment, in this space where we can learn so much from your experience and where we can share your experience and perhaps improve our own lives because of what you've gone through. There is so much here to cover. I'm not even sure where to begin, but you've done an excellent job of bringing us from the beginning, before you had your sea legs as a reporter, to where we are now and the unrest that this country is currently facing. So, and then how one woman with 3 daughters and a husband was able to do all this. So there's a lot that we can cover here, but I just want to welcome you and let you know that we are so appreciative of your time and what you're sharing with us. But let's start. I want to start with your arrival at the Washington Post, because as I read your book, there are so many candid reveals that you share about yourself before you got your sea legs, as you put it in one of the passages in your book. And I wrote this quote down. You said, "You did not want to be stereotypical as qualified to cover only Black stories, but you ended up covering Black stories and Black issues and Black individuals, and those stories that you set out not to do, it became your brand. It became a powerful brand for you. That's who you are today." So if you would, for the audience, talk to us about your personal growth and development and how you stepped into your purpose.
Well, thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to meet you as well. And yes, I think there was a certain level of naivete when I took that position of not wanting to be stereotyped, and thought that I could only cover Black stories. But at the same time, it was kind of an important phase to go through, which is to understand that many of my colleagues were going to think that's all I could do, and I had to show that I could do more. I could do any story to which I was assigned. But what happened, and it was really providential for me, was that it was the beginning of the war on poverty. There was great interest in welfare. These were stories that were getting, front page coverage. There was a very strong woman there who was, covering the beat. But there were so many other stories on these topics that were not being covered. So I think I kind of proved my point because, at this point in, 1961, as I said, it's a really sharp division between Black and white. And, but it turned out that when I started covering some of those stories that I really cared about, I was able to do what all reporters like to do, which is get stories on page 1. And they were certainly well received. But I think it was a phase I went through, and a little naive, but with some, I think, knowledge that by doing all kinds of stories, I was being lifted up a little bit in the eyes of the people with whom I worked.
Right. You talked about in your remarks just a few moments ago about Alex Wilson, and what happened to your boss in Little Rock. And it kind of made me think about several different passages that I read in your book, where you talk about internalizing anger at injustices, anger over how whites addressed your mom. You talked about your mom being trained as a teacher, but having to work as a maid, and you internalized that anger. You internalized the anger over this savage beating of your boss. And it sort of made me think about the civil unrest that we see occurring across the country, and the journalists who are on the front lines covering that. People like myself who are reporting on those stories day in and day out. As journalists covering this present day civil unrest, we could benefit from hearing you talk about how you managed that anger, and you were able to push through to be a positive influence and a master at training journalists. So how do you keep that in control and turn it into something good?
Well, I think part of my ability to do that came from my upbringing. As I said, I happened to be a preacher's kid, and I had been taught that it's important to not hate. It's important to not try to retaliate against everybody who tries to hurt you. And it's important to be strong within yourself. But at the same time, I think it probably internalized too much because it did hurt me at times. There'd be times when, you know, I would take it out on myself in ways like harming myself with food and things that, you know, ended up making me not look the way I wanted to look or even feel the way I wanted to feel. So part of what I had to do was to, you know, find ways to be all I could be, at the same time knowing that, you know, this is in so many ways it's a very sick nation. It's a very sick nation, and in a way, I would say, well, you know, how would I treat a sick friend? You know, I would try to pity him. I would try to tolerate him. You know, I wouldn't, you know, ingest and do things to harm myself because of what was going on in the larger world. So I also was definitely taught that, you know, hate is too heavy a load to carry because it hurts the hater more than it hurts the person who is hated. And so there was never that, you know, that level of you know, intense anti-feeling that I had. But it definitely was hard. And you know, I think the other part was that I think diversity and inclusion and democracy and all those things for which we've worked so hard, I think they're worth fighting for. And that's what we're seeing now with the protests of the young people. You know, I'm so proud of them. And I know that most of this is definitely nonviolent, that this, you know, I'd like to see more stories about who some of the other groups who have been, you know, showing up really are. I'm not satisfied that that's being deeply and well covered.
Do better than most. What did that mean for a young Black reporter coming out of Memphis, embarking on her journalism career at a white newspaper when there really was no playbook at all that you could follow during segregation? Do better than best.
Do better than most or do better than best?
Do better than best is what you wrote in your book. So I'm just curious, what did that mean to a young Black reporter coming out of Memphis. I mean, it's just amazing, your accomplishments really
Yeah,
are, considering that you didn't have a playbook to kind of guide you through this, and you
that's
were
very true.
curious.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that helped me, do better was that there was a Black community in Washington that from which I gained support. I'm talking about a Black community of journalists, particularly because I had worked at JET for a couple of years. I knew the people at the JET Washington Bureau. And so when I would go there and talk and chat. I would go there when I had problems. For example, when I needed a new place to stay, I went there, and this wonderful woman that I talk about in the book, Fanny Granton, would help me find lodging, things that, the newspaper wasn't providing. And, but that the strength of what I've seen, I had seen up until then in my community. The people who work so hard and who accomplish so much, at the same time had so many more trials and obstacles that they had to really deal with and face than white Americans. I had seen their courage, I had seen their strength, and then just again being able to go and get a certain level of love and support and sustenance from them was also extremely helpful.
All right, that's awesome. Let's take a question from the audience. Jeff South has a question for you. He says, Mrs. Gilliam, I'm interested in your thoughts about how white newsrooms have traditionally approached objectivity to quote one side of a controversy and then seek out a quote from the other side. On issues of racism, that approach seems to give both sides equal weight. Do you think journalists should be objective? What does objectivity mean to you? Kind of a long question. We can, I can repeat it if you like.
No, I get the gist of it. It's not
Okay.
a question that's often asked. And I think my job is to try to be neutral, to tell both sides of the story. That does not mean that I am going to try to make one side more important than the other and one side less important. My job, I think, is to if I'm going to tell the truth, there's always two sides to the story, and that at least two sides. There's can be many more, but I see my job as trying to tell the truth. It's truth telling, finding out what are the facts, and sometimes in reporting, you don't have all the facts. You have to go with what you have. But if you are really dedicated to seeking the truth, to really correcting the error, to exposing the real, and finding ways to negate those things that are not real, those things that are not true, then I think it's very hard to say that you are not objective, because you're telling both sides. I don't mean by that if let's just say if a cop is accused of murdering a Black person, that we have to spend as much time on the cop as we are on the person who was killed. I think there's a certain level of kind of common sense that has to be the motivating factor. But I think many people now say that there is no such thing as objectivity. And that is one of those phrases, is one of those concepts that, has really lost its meaning. But I think that it's still possible to, start from the motivation of truth telling. What can I tell about the situation? And there's a story on both sides. And that doesn't mean that one side is getting off scot-free. It just means that you give the reader the opportunity to hear both sides of the story. I understand how that can be perceived as erroneous almost. But I don't think at this point, from my perspective, and I'm not, a daily newspaper reporter anymore. So I'm speaking, kind of in a vague way. But I think it's still possible. But truth telling is the thing. So we have to say, as we find out things, say about issues of race in America, as we discover new things, there's an incredibly strong book called Cast that has recently appeared by Isabel Wilkerson. And she is really showing aspects of how this system in America was organized, was how much race and racism was a part of it from the inception. So when you get new information like that, the question becomes, how do you use it? And I think you use that as part of explaining why what is going on right now.
You're right. Truth seeking, that's who we are as journalists. But in this age of fake news and attacks on journalists, it becomes even more pressing that maintains the forefront of what we do. And that is to get not just both sides, all sides of the story, and to be diligent in finding out the facts and reporting the truth, spotlighting the truth, because we are criticized at every end, at every point. And we find ourselves, I think, more and more, just because of the climate of the country now, we find ourselves more and more having to defend ourselves. Just curious how you see social media all playing into that, and some of the comments we see coming out of the White House as well.
Yeah, one of the really awful things about this period has been, a president who attacks truth telling and who the whole moniker of fake news, is just so, all of this is just so detrimental to democracy because it stops people from, trusting, from understanding. It's like this huge barrier that's thrown up in the minds of so many people. So I think we're in a very dangerous situation now, where the democracy is being threatened, and as the Post masthead says, democracy dies in darkness. And so our job is to try to shed the light on what's really going on, and that means really telling more deeply the story, deeply the stories about race and racism, more deeply the story about white supremacy. It's going to have to go deep before we are able to really begin to accept, understand, change, and make a difference.
All right, let's get another question from the audience. This one is from David Squires, and David writes, with the massive cutting of newsroom staffs, how will the industry cover the stories of people of color? Could this be done via social media, citizens journalism, that's an interesting phrase, or some mechanism still being developed?
I don't have the answer to that, David. I think that the challenge is there, but I think they're just so, this is like new century journalism in so many ways. The entrance of social media has had a profound effect, but at the same time, it has positive effects, but it also has negative effects. The fact that you can now video, the horror of a George Floyd being murdered, before our eyes, that's important. But at the same time, we have the responsibility of telling, all sides. And I think we all know that there are huge problems with social media. There are positives and there are negatives. To say that I'm really no expert on that subject, but social media is not going anywhere. It's here, and the question becomes, how do we really deal with it? It's still very much in play, just in terms of, as we know, the attacks on leaders, and but where it's all going to end, I just don't know.
Here's a question from the audience from an aspiring journalist, Shanaz. I hope I'm not butchering your name, but she poses an interesting question dealing with being a female and an aspiring journalist. And she says that she often worries about being doubted of my talents in this industry. What actions do you suggest I take in order to prove my worth and my work ethic? I want to show that all races, ethnicities, and genders can produce equal quality of work.
Well, that's a very good question and a good point that she is making, because I think that gets to the heart of the issue in terms of why there's such toleration of people who don't want African Americans to be in media, who don't want African Americans to have jobs, to have roles as bosses, as managers, and those things that make a difference. I think right now we're just beginning to kind of tap the first thin layer of what this country is going to have to deal with in terms of really bringing about real inclusiveness and a real sense of African Americans belonging. But I think what I would say to this young lady is, there is no magic bullet. It is, to go and to, work as hard as you can in terms of the stories that you write. Make sure they're well produced, make sure they're correct. Enterprise reporting is still very important. And the nation is becoming more diverse than ever. And so it's gonna need people like you, but it's not always going to welcome people like you. But I think that you have to have that sense inside of you that what I am doing is important. What I am doing is crucial. What I am doing makes a difference. It makes a difference to the democracy, or to even threats against the democracy. It makes a difference to the readers. And I also think long form journalism is still very important. The social media kind of in and out, 25 words or whatever the limit on the number of words, in a tweet. That's one thing, but to really inform people, to really help them understand, that's another story. And so I think that there always will be a need for long form journalism. But I really would encourage this young lady to get ready to struggle, but also get ready to know a deep sense of satisfaction when you write a story that makes a difference. When you tell about a situation that nobody knows about, when you really, you know, use that front row seat on history, you know, to make a difference. And I think, you know, the chances of your succeeding are going to be very, very strong. But, you know, some flexibility. You're not going to win every battle, but you know, give it your best shot, and realize that, you know, tomorrow is another day. You know, you have another chance. But don't be intimidated. Don't know that you are not what other people may say you are. You know, you are not what they may think you are, you know, but know who you are. You define yourself and keep that strength, you know, about yourself, within yourself. And you can really make a difference.
That is great advice. And we're getting some really good questions from the audience. We have a question from Facebook from Vivian. And Vivian wants to know, did you find any Latino allies in the newsroom or in general in the 60s?
I found the most Latino allies in the 70s. I was at the Post in the early 60s, and then I actually quit when I got married and started having children. But I was rehired by the Post in the 70s. And when I talked about the Institute for Journalism Education and the Maynard Institute, there were Latino journalists as among the co-founders, and there were Latino journalists who have been, you know, colleagues of mine for many, many years. So one of the things we learned was, as people of color, that it was important for us to be inclusive, because we had to show that that is the reality of this country. And so that is very important. And one of the things that when I became president of the National Association of Black Journalists, we worked with the 4 groups, the Latino journalists, Native American journalists, Asian American, and the National Association of Black Journalists. And we came together and gave this huge unity convention in Atlanta, Georgia in 1994. And so we had, we really learned that we had to face our cultural differences. We had to face the cultural challenges. There were some African Americans who thought, you know, we've been here longer, we've done the hardest work, and now, you know, all of these other groups are really trying to, you know, steal the glory. And, you know, I was able to get some really strong people to come in and talk to the leaders, people who knew how to help them understand what needed to happen in order to give a successful convention. So yes, allies across racial lines, so important. And in our first, I guess I said this so many times, but I'll repeat it. The Institute for Journalism Education, we had, there were 8 founders, and I was only one of the co-founders, but we had a Jewish guy, a gay Jewish guy, we had Latino, we had Asian, we've always had that mix.
All right, we have a question from a very talented, tremendously talented local author, Stacy Hawkins Adams, and she wants to know, how can we encourage readers to care more about long-form narrative journalism versus brief stories that don't always allow for context and balance?
Well, I think you are very correct that we really need to have more of that. Unfortunately, I think there's almost developing a kind of a separation in society of those people who really want to take the time and the effort to read and understand what is going on. Those who feel that they they can't function without deep knowledge. They don't want to live on the surface of life. And so I think there are going to always be those people. And unfortunately, it's not as large as it needs to be. But I think that we must continue with that long form journalism, because that's really the way that we begin to understand our country and understand each other, by those in-depth stories. I look at what Nicole Hamlin Penna Jones did in 1619, in that New York Times, great New York Times series. That's priceless, but we all have the obligation to do that. And we can't be naive about what's happening in this country now, because people who are really digging deep and writing the truth, they're being threatened. So it's a difficult time, but it's a time when we still must go forward. And I have so much admiration for people like Isabel Wilkerson in her new book, Caste, where, she's being threatened and people don't want that out. And Nicole Hannah Jones, when she tells the truth, and people don't want that out, but, they continue. And, they really are our heroines.
Dorothy, you are definitely a shining example of what happens when hard work, intelligence meet opportunity. In fact, you created many of your own opportunities. You also had, as you wrote in your book, a front row seat to two revolutions, the civil rights movement, women's rights. You did not sit down, you stood up and you took action. As we talk about diversity, I can say here where I work, NBC 12 embraces diversity and nurtures that. But there are stations, newsrooms in other states across this country where there is no diversity. There are many missing voices in how the news is put together and how the news is presented and how neighborhoods are covered. So if you would speak to journalists who are in that position where they would like to see diversity and may not feel that they even have the voice to fight or go to a manager and sit down and say, let's change this picture. It's not reflective of the communities that we cover. So if you could say something to journalists who find themselves in that position, and even managers who might be reluctant for whatever reason to make an effort for diversity.
I think one thing they can do would be to reach out to organizations like the Maynard Institute and talk about, what are some of the offerings they have that could help convince their newsroom managers that it would be valuable to them. For example, one of the offerings of the Maynard Institute is one called Fault Lines. And it comes out of many years ago, but the concept of the fault lines, between under the earth that one knows about in the case of earthquakes. But the kind of bottom line is that it's important that newsrooms, television, radio, newspapers know that they have to look at certain things for a story to be complete. And it's race, it's gender, it's class, it's geography. For example, people who live in the West think differently than people who live in New York City. I mean, what are the differences? You know, so there's much more to that whole fault lines concept. But these organizations, such as the Maynard Institute, they exist to try to help newspapers and news stations and, you know, all of the various kinds of media. They exist to try to help make this a more, you know, inclusive country. And so there's so many resources that are available. And I would definitely suggest that, you know, the staff at the Maynard Institute right now, you can go online and you can find the Maynard Institute. We have Evelyn Sue is the director, Martin, blanking on his last name. He is their co-executive directors. And, you know, they are working with newspapers around the country and with other stations. They've also recently formed a partnership with the Online News Association. So I think that there are organizations that can be very helpful to people who want to make a difference, but how do you make the difference? And just as, you know, when we started back in many years ago, we kept changing as we saw the need. You know, first you train reporters, then you train editors because that was the need. Then you train managers. And one of the reasons we wanted to train managers was because if white managers often need training, they need to know something about these communities. You know, they very often live in a very small bubble. And so how do you you know, really break through, you know, that bubble and say, listen, this is the world, this is the larger world. And in many ways, I think this pandemic is a good way to, you know, a good time to have more of that, because the media has really has fallen way short in terms of really explaining the differences between the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on communities of color. It's kind of said, yes, there are. We know it's a disproportionate impact, but what is it, and why, and how, and where? You know, all the questions that we need to ask.
All excellent points and excellent resources that you provided. We appreciate it. We have a question, another question from Facebook. This one is from Haley Zurcher, and Haley writes, Latinx and African Americans lives seem to be some of the most targeted communities in the United States right now. I am Black and a Mexican student journalist covering diversity for the first time. What advice would you give to student journalists like me to stay motivated without burnout on a topic so close to home?
No, that's a very good question. That's a very real question. And I think, you know, you will go through periods when your insights and your ability to add value to a subject are greater at certain times than at others. And I think this is a time when it's one of those times when you can, you know, you have so much to share. There's so many stories that need to be told about, you know, African American women and Latinx. You know, all of these things need to be talked about. And I know that it can be exhausting, it can be tiring, but it's important to use the momentum that's really building from the people themselves, and, you know, write about what's going on. And it's not going to happen, you know, forever. These things have a way of, unfortunately, make 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward. But I think, you know, try to understand that, you know, that a story that's topical, like, you know, those people who have been covering the pandemic for the last 8 months, they still, it's hard and it's exhausting, but it's a story that needs telling, and they have a way to tell it. And I think the same would be the case with you. Yes, in many ways you are targeted, and that makes it very uncomfortable. But your challenge is, you know, to find ways to do the stories without harming yourself. You know, make certain that you continue with your self-care, but still, and realize you can't do every story. You have to pick and choose. But you know, it's so important to continue, you know, your self-care in terms of those things that, you know, that give you vibrancy and give you strength. But at the same time, know that, you know, this too shall pass. You won't have this level of interest in the subject, and you really have to take advantage of that while you have it.
You know, as a journalist, I am probably sometimes more interested in what was edited out as opposed to what was included. And there was there's a passage on page 215 of your book that it just made me think, and I wanted to know, well, what happened with this conversation? And this is when you were talking about your ideas with Ben Bradley, and you wanted something specific to happen. I think you wanted the columnist position then. I believe that's what that page was all about. And it didn't happen, but you ended up walking out with something. So what was your idea, and why did he shoot it down?
Well, my idea was that I wanted to come out of the style section, because it was clear that they thought I was doing too many Black stories as one of the editors. They wanted, the country was shifting to a more conservative place. So my idea was that I would like to be editor of the magazine. The weekly magazine was called Potomac at that point. And my idea was that I would be the editor and come up with, you know, a whole new concept for it, and you know, make it a better product. And he basically said, you know, no, we're not planning on making any changes right now. So, but is there anything else you're interested in? And that's something that would often happen in you know, when you go to executives with an idea, and if for whatever reason they are unable to do it, or you know, the idea doesn't fly, they will often say, well, is there anything else you want to do? And so I came up with the idea of a column. And I really hadn't really seriously thought about that before. But so that was kind of standard operating procedure. You know, if you go to a higher up and say, I want to do this, and they say, well, no, you can't do this, but anything else you want to do, you know, so.
Right. Talk about your role as president of the National Association of Black Journalists.
Well, that was a very challenging role. I had a lot to learn. NABJ is a very important organization, has very strong personalities. I had my strengths and my weaknesses. I had to acknowledge that. But I think what we did that was really important was to be the main organization behind that unity convention in Atlanta in 1994. It was so important that thousands of journalists of color, came together and, met and talked and discussed and, and talked about the past, the present, and the future. And at that point, technology was just beginning to emerge. And so there were, so many really important things that we talked about. But I think it was also important to just let people know the importance of people working together on like-minded projects that what we all had in common. And that's what I kept talking to them about. Let's not look at what separates us. Let's look at what we have in common. And it's kind of like unity through diversity. We can work together on those things that we agree would help all of us, because our concern was that none of our communities were being adequately covered. And so, once you could get people to see, okay, what can we do that will help us all? That seemed to be, one of the things that got us through. But I have to say that my tenure had some bumpy spots, and part of it was probably me. I think I was pretty strong-willed on certain things. I thought, for example, that there were things that an organization could do that an individual couldn't do, and that sounds kind of obvious. But I think some people would think that, well, if we're journalists, we have to be totally objective all the time. And I said, well, yeah, as individuals, I mean, you have to be able to cover any story and to tell both sides of the story. But as an organization, there are many things that you can do and that we should do, and that I sometimes did.
I would like to close reading a passage from Dorothy's book. It's a passage that she chose and considers to be important. Black Lives Matter and other important movements that may turn out to be equivalent to the civil rights movement are due to young people's adept use of social media. The media is now in the process of developing what its future is going to be. Media and technology are partners like never before. Media is more important today than ever, despite the internet, despite social media, despite all of the new ways for exchanging information. Regardless of the technology, questions and challenges remain to end white superiority and low Black self-esteem. The current attacks on the media are very dangerous. American democracy, while flawed, as I experienced growing up during segregation, has nevertheless been a touchstone around the world. A president who attacks freedom of press, even if tweeted and erased the next day, has a very destabilizing effect on our democracy and throughout the world. I am very proud of how far African Americans have come, although I still see fear of people of color in the white community. While white fear has definitely changed since I began my career, I would like to say to whites, don't be afraid of the African American voice. Be an ally. Racial equality, diversity, and inclusion benefit you. Dorothy Butler Gilliam, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experiences. We thank the audience for your wonderful questions. And Bonnie and Marcus, I thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this evening. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much. You were a wonderful questioner.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy and Diane, for what one of our viewers on Facebook said. This was incredibly inspiring, and a lot of our viewers shared that sentiment. Thanks so much for inspiring our students. They take a lot from this as they move forward into a difficult reporting environment. I think we can all agree on that. Thanks so much for sharing your story and inspiring all of us. I'd also like to thank Bonnie Davis and Jeff South for helping organize this event and being our co-sponsors here tonight. I hope we will see everybody back in a little over 3 weeks. We will be 2 days after the election at that point, and we're going to put together an alumni panel that we're just simply going to title What Happened. So we all look forward to seeing you on November 5th, and we all wish you a wonderful evening tonight.